Stay in the back. Guests don't want staff in the photos. The words were quiet, almost polite. Somehow that made them hurt more. Grace Bennett simply nodded and stepped away from the ballroom entrance without arguing. She had learned a long time ago that some battles cost more energy than they were worth. Around her, the Grand Astoria ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers the size of small cars. Golden lights spilled across polished marble floors. A string quartet played near the stage, their music floating above the soft hum of conversations worth millions of dollars. The city's most powerful people had gathered under one roof tonight. CEOs, investors, politicians, athletes, people whose names appeared in magazines and whose faces appeared on giant screens. Grace belonged to none of those worlds. So she moved quietly into the shadows near the back wall, carrying an empty silver tray and hoping the rest of her shift would pass unnoticed. The ballroom smelled of expensive perfume, fresh roses, and success. Everywhere she looked, photographers captured smiles that seemed practiced. Champagne glasses clinked. Laughter echoed beneath the towering ceilings. Men adjusted tailored jackets. Women glided through the room in designer gowns worth more than Grace's monthly rent. It was beautiful. It was elegant. And it was a place that constantly reminded her where she stood. Near the back of the room. Out of sight. Out of the story. Grace lowered her eyes and checked the time on her watch. 8:17 p.m. Another 4 hours until she could go home. 4 hours until she could return to the tiny apartment she shared with her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. 4 hours until she could stop smiling for strangers and become herself again. A server passed by carrying a tray of sparkling water. "You okay?" he whispered. Grace smiled softly. Always. It was the same answer she gave everyone. The same answer she had given for years. She was tired. She was worried. She was carrying more responsibility than anyone in this room could imagine. But she was okay. Or at least she pretended to be. Because pretending was easier. Across the ballroom, cameras suddenly flashed. Heads turned. Conversations shifted direction. A wave of attention rolled through the crowd like a breeze moving across water. Someone important had arrived. Grace followed the movement and saw him enter. Ethan Walker, the billionaire founder of Walker Capital. 6'3", dark navy tuxedo. Calm expression. The kind of man people noticed the moment he entered a room. Some men demanded attention. Ethan Walker never seemed to ask for it. Yet somehow he received more of it than anyone else. Investors immediately surrounded him. Reporters leaned forward. Guests adjusted their posture as he passed. But Ethan moved through the crowd with surprising ease, offering polite smiles without lingering too long anywhere. Grace watched for only a moment before returning to work. People like Ethan Walker existed in a different universe. Their paths never crossed with people like her. At least not in any meaningful way. Near one of the side tables, an elderly janitor struggled to move a heavy display stand that had shifted out of place. Most guests walked past without noticing. Grace set down her tray and crossed the room. "Here," she said gently. "Let me help." Together they adjusted the display. The man smiled gratefully. "Thank you." "Of course." She straightened the tablecloth and returned to her station before anyone could complain she had stepped away. It was a small moment. Forgettable. Invisible. The kind of thing Grace did every day. And like most acts of kindness, it disappeared almost as quickly as it happened. Or so she thought. Because from across the ballroom, someone had been watching. Ethan Walker stood near the center of the room, speaking with a group of executives. Yet his eyes briefly drifted away from the conversation. Past the cameras. Past the spotlight. Past the famous faces everyone else admired. They landed for a moment on the woman standing quietly against the back wall. The single mother no one had bothered to notice. Grace never saw him looking. She simply picked up her tray and moved farther into the shadows after another event coordinator motioned for staff to remain out of sight. The music continued. The lights sparkled overhead. The ballroom celebrated wealth, influence, and prestige. But somewhere in that crowded room, the story had already begun to change. Neither Grace nor anyone else knew it yet. The richest man in the ballroom had just noticed the woman everyone else had asked to disappear. At 8:43 p.m., while the ballroom glowed brighter than ever, Grace Bennett was thinking about a hospital bill folded inside her purse. The paper had been creased so many times that the corners were beginning to tear. She did not need to read the numbers anymore. She already knew them by heart. Every dollar, every deadline, Every payment she still could not afford. The quartet continued playing near the stage while laughter drifted through the room like music of its own. Around her, guests discussed investments, luxury vacations, and market forecasts. Grace balanced a tray of sparkling water and moved carefully between tables, smiling whenever someone glanced her way. Most never did. To them, she was part of the furniture. A moving piece of the ballroom that appeared when needed and disappeared just as quickly. Grace did not resent them. Life had taught her that bitterness was expensive. It drained energy she could not spare. Every ounce of strength belonged to Lily. Her daughter was the reason she woke up before sunrise. The reason she worked weekends. The reason she kept moving even on days when exhaustion settled deep inside her bones. Earlier that morning, Lily had been sitting at their small kitchen table coloring pictures before school. Her blonde hair had been tied into a crooked ponytail she insisted looked perfect. Grace remembered kneeling beside her. Lily had smiled and held up a drawing. It showed the two of them standing beneath a giant rainbow. Above them, she had written 3 words in uneven letters. "We got this." Grace had laughed despite everything. Children had a way of seeing hope where adults saw problems. That drawing was now folded inside her locker at work. A reminder. A promise. A reason not to quit. Near the ballroom entrance, a guest accidentally dropped a designer clutch. Several people stepped around it without noticing. Grace quietly retrieved it and hurried after the woman. "Excuse me, ma'am." The woman turned. Surprise crossed her face. Then relief. "Oh goodness. Thank you." Grace handed over the purse and smiled. "You are welcome." The guest nodded before disappearing back into the crowd. It was another small moment. Another act of kindness that would likely be forgotten within minutes. Yet Grace treated every person the same, whether they owned a private jet or cleaned office buildings at night. Her mother had taught her that long ago. Character was what you did when nobody was paying attention. Unfortunately, character did not pay rent. Her phone vibrated quietly inside her apron pocket. Grace stepped into a service corridor and checked the screen. A text message from her neighbor, Mrs. Dalton. "Lily is doing homework. She says good luck tonight, Mom." A photograph followed. Lily sat at the kitchen table concentrating on a math worksheet, her tongue slightly sticking out the way it always did when she focused. Grace stared at the image for several seconds. The tension in her shoulders softened. Then another message appeared. She also asked if you remembered Friday. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Friday. The school field trip. $28. Not a fortune to most people inside this ballroom. To Grace, it was another calculation. Another choice between needs and necessities. She typed back quickly. "Tell her I remembered. Thank you." When she returned to the ballroom, the energy had shifted. More guests had arrived. More cameras flashed. The evening was building toward its main presentation. At the center of it all stood Ethan Walker. Grace noticed him speaking with several investors near the stage. Everyone seemed eager for his attention. Yet something about him remained strangely distant. He listened more than he spoke. He smiled, but never for long. Even surrounded by hundreds of people, there was a loneliness about him that did not seem to belong in a room like this. As Grace moved toward the refreshment station, she noticed an older maintenance worker sitting alone near a service door. He looked pale and exhausted. Most guests would never have noticed him. Grace did. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later carrying a bottle of water and a sandwich left over from staff catering. "You should eat something," she said gently. The man looked surprised. "I cannot take your food." "Then pretend you are doing me a favor." He laughed softly and accepted it. Grace smiled before walking away. She never saw the pair of eyes watching from across the ballroom. Ethan Walker had paused in the middle of a conversation. For a brief moment, the words around him faded. He watched the waitress everyone else ignored offer kindness without expectation. No cameras, no audience, no reward, just kindness, the rarest currency in the room. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he found himself unable to look away. By 9 o'clock, the ballroom had become a world unto itself. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across hundreds of faces. The stage screens displayed charity figures climbing higher with every donation. Applause rolled through the room in steady waves. Wealth moved through the air like electricity. Yet for Ethan Walker, the evening was becoming strangely difficult to focus on. Another investor was speaking to him about a potential merger. Numbers, forecasts, expansion plans. The kind of conversation he had navigated thousands of times before. Ethan nodded politely, but part of his attention remained elsewhere. Across the ballroom, Grace Bennett continued working as though nobody was watching, which, for the most part, was true. Guests thanked her without remembering her face. Event organizers directed her from one corner of the room to another. She blended into the background so naturally that most people never noticed how often she was helping others. Ethan noticed. That was becoming a problem. "Ethan," one executive asked, "what do you think?" Ethan blinked. The conversation snapped back into focus. "I think we should revisit the proposal next week." The group nodded immediately. No one questioned him. They rarely did. Being one of the most successful investors in the country had a way of ending debates before they began. But as the executives continued talking, Ethan found himself wondering something far more unusual. What kind of person remained kind when life gave them every reason not to be? He knew wealth. He knew ambition. He knew success. Those things were measurable, predictable. But genuine kindness was different. It could not be bought. It could not be negotiated. And it was becoming increasingly rare. Across the room, Grace stopped near a floral display to adjust a vase that had begun leaning dangerously toward the edge of a table. Then she helped an elderly guest find a seat closer to the stage. A few minutes later, she guided a nervous young server through a complicated drink order. Each action lasted only seconds. None of them would appear in photographs. None of them would earn applause. Yet she performed them all with the same quiet grace. Ethan watched from a distance. Nearby, his longtime assistant, Claire Morrison, noticed. "You have been staring at the same waitress for almost 20 minutes. Ethan looked away. "Have I?" Claire folded her arms. "You know I have worked for you for 7 years. And you never notice anyone." Ethan almost smiled. "That is not true." "It is completely true." Claire glanced across the ballroom. "What is different about her?" Ethan considered the question. Surprisingly, he did not have an answer. Because the truth sounded ridiculous. She reminded him of someone. Not physically, not even in the way she spoke. It was something deeper. Something about the way she carried herself despite being overlooked. Something about the quiet dignity she seemed determined to protect. Ethan's eyes drifted toward Grace once more. She was standing near a service station now, checking a small folded note. Her expression softened briefly. Then she carefully placed the paper back into her apron pocket. For a second, Ethan wondered what was written on it. A grocery list. A reminder. A bill. A message from someone she loved. He did not know why he cared. But he did. Meanwhile, Grace was trying very hard not to think about the clock. The later it became, the more she worried about Lily sleeping at home. Mrs. Dalton was trustworthy. She had helped them countless times. Still, mothers worried. It was part of the job description no one talked about. Grace reached for a tray of empty glasses and headed toward the ballroom's far side. As she passed one of the VIP tables, she overheard fragments of conversation. Stock prices, luxury resorts, private islands. A woman laughed about spending $12,000 on a handbag. Grace nearly smiled. $12,000 would cover months of rent. The thought disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Comparing lives never improved your own. Her mother had taught her that too. Focus on what matters. Grace always tried. At the center of the ballroom, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. A spotlight swept across the crowd. The room gradually quieted. Conversations faded. Chairs turned toward the stage. The evening's featured presentation was about to begin. Ethan took his seat at the head table. Cameras immediately shifted in his direction. Reporters prepared their questions. Donors adjusted their posture. Everyone expected the billionaire CEO to be the most important person in the room tonight. Ethan looked toward the back of the ballroom one more time. Grace was already moving toward the shadows again, carrying another tray, trying not to be seen. For reasons he could not explain, he felt a strange certainty settle over him. Before this night was over, that was going to change. The spotlight settled over the stage like sunlight breaking through clouds. Applause filled the ballroom as the master of ceremonies welcomed guests to the annual Walker Foundation Gala. Cameras flashed. Crystal glasses sparkled. The evening had officially entered its most important hour. Grace Bennett remained exactly where she preferred to be. Invisible. She carried a tray toward the rear service station and quietly exchanged empty glasses for full ones. Around her, conversations grew louder as donors competed to pledge larger amounts. $50,000. $100,000. $250,000. Numbers floated through the air so casually that they almost sounded unreal. Grace tried not to listen. She had learned long ago that comparing her life to others only made heavy things feel heavier. Still, some numbers were impossible to ignore. One guest announced a donation larger than what Grace would earn in several years. The crowd applauded. Grace smiled politely and continued walking. At the center of the room, Ethan Walker sat beneath the glow of the stage lights. Every camera seemed drawn to him. Every major donor wanted a moment of his attention. Yet his focus drifted repeatedly toward the edges of the ballroom. Claire noticed again. "You are missing half the speeches." Ethan glanced toward the stage. "I heard enough." "No. You heard the words. You are thinking about something else." Ethan did not answer immediately. The charity presentation continued as video screens displayed stories of families receiving support from the foundation. Children, veterans, teachers, people rebuilding their lives after difficult circumstances. Normally, Ethan paid close attention to these moments. The foundation mattered deeply to him. Tonight, something felt different. He found himself watching actions instead of speeches, watching people instead of presentations. And every time he did, his attention returned to Grace. Near one of the side tables, a catering assistant accidentally dropped a stack of folded napkins. The young woman immediately looked embarrassed. Several guests glanced over. Grace appeared almost instantly. She knelt beside the assistant, helped gather the napkins, and quietly said something that made the young woman smile again. Then she disappeared before anyone could thank her. Another small act. Another moment nobody else would remember. Ethan remembered. A few minutes later, the charity auction began. Luxury vacation packages, rare artwork, exclusive experiences. Bidding paddles rose across the ballroom. The energy became electric. Guests laughed and competed for attention. Money flowed like water. Grace continued moving between tables, refilling drinks and collecting plates. During a brief pause, she checked her phone again. Another message from Mrs. Dalton. "Lily fell asleep on the couch waiting for you." Grace stared at the screen. A smile touched her face despite her exhaustion. She could picture it perfectly. Lily curled beneath her favorite blanket. One sock missing. Television still playing softly in the background. The image warmed something inside her. Then she noticed a second photograph attached to the message. It showed Lily asleep with the rainbow drawing resting beside her. "We got this." Grace swallowed hard and slipped the phone back into her pocket before emotion could overwhelm her. She had work to do. Across the ballroom, Ethan caught that brief expression. The smile. The sadness behind it. The quiet determination. It reminded him of someone from a life he rarely discussed. Someone who had spent years sacrificing comfort so another person could have opportunities. The memory surfaced without warning. A small apartment. Second-hand furniture. A woman arriving home late from work and pretending she was not exhausted. His mother. Ethan looked away for a moment. The memory hit harder than expected. Success had changed many things. It had not erased where he came from. The auction reached its final item. Applause thundered through the room after a record-breaking bid. Guests celebrated. Photographers rushed toward the winning table. Amid all the excitement, an elderly gentleman near the back struggled to stand from his chair. His cane slipped sideways. Before anyone else noticed, Grace was there. She steadied the chair, helped him regain balance, and made certain he was comfortable before quietly stepping away. The gentleman smiled gratefully. She simply nodded. Ethan watched every second of it. Something settled in his mind. Not curiosity, not admiration. Certainty. The kind that arrives unexpectedly and refuses to leave. Claire leaned closer. "What are you thinking?" Ethan's gaze remained fixed across the ballroom. Grace was already disappearing toward the shadows again, carrying her tray, trying to avoid attention. Ethan answered without looking away. "I think everyone in this room has been paying attention to the wrong person all night." Claire followed his gaze. For the first time, she understood exactly who he meant. The auction concluded with another round of applause, but the energy inside the Grand Astoria ballroom had begun to change. The excitement of competition slowly gave way to conversation, music, and celebration. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays. Guests gathered into small circles beneath the chandeliers. Somewhere near the stage, a jazz ensemble replaced the string quartet, filling the room with warm notes that drifted through the air like candlelight. Grace Bennett welcomed the change. The closer the evening moved toward its conclusion, the closer she was to going home. Her feet ached. Her shoulders were tired. But she knew better than to complain. Someday survival looked less like triumph and more like endurance. Tonight was one of those days. She stopped briefly near a service station and poured herself a glass of water. It was the first moment she had sat down all evening. Just 30 seconds. Nothing more. As she lowered herself onto a small chair, her phone vibrated again. This time it was not a text message. It was a voicemail notification. Grace hesitated before pressing play. Lily's sleepy voice filled her ear. "Hi, Mom. Mrs. Dalton said you were still working. I just wanted to tell you I got an A on my spelling test. I knew I would because you helped me study. Do not worry about Friday if it is too expensive. We can do something fun at home instead. I love you." Grace closed her eyes. For a moment, the noise of the ballroom faded. The applause. The music. The conversations worth millions. None of it mattered compared to a little girl trying to make life easier for her mother. Grace listened to the message a second time, then a third. By the time she slipped the phone away, her eyes were shining. Not from sadness. From love. The kind that made impossible things feel possible. She stood and returned to work before anyone noticed she had been gone. Across the room, Ethan Walker was engaged in conversation with a group of major donors. Yet his attention remained divided. He had spent most of his adult life learning to read people. It was one of the reasons he had become successful. Numbers told stories. Markets told stories. People told stories too. And something about Grace's story felt familiar. Not because he knew her. He did not. Not because he understood her life. He could never fully understand it. But because he recognized sacrifice when he saw it. Years ago, before the private jets and magazine covers, before the billion-dollar deals, there had been a small apartment on the edge of Chicago. A mother working double shifts. A refrigerator that was rarely full. A boy pretending not to notice when his mother skipped dinner so he could eat more. Ethan had spent years trying to outrun those memories. Tonight they seemed determined to catch him. Claire approached carrying a tablet. "The press interviews are ready whenever you are." Ethan nodded absently. "In a few minutes." Claire studied him. "You are thinking about your mother." Ethan looked surprised. "How do you know that?" "Because that expression only appears when you are." Ethan glanced toward the far side of the ballroom. Grace was helping another employee organize supplies near a service entrance. She was smiling at something the young woman said. A genuine smile. Tired but genuine. Claire followed his gaze again. This time she said nothing. She no longer needed an explanation. Near the stage, the band shifted into a slower melody. Several couples began gathering on the dance floor. The polished marble reflected golden light as elegant shoes moved across its surface. Guests laughed softly. Cameras continued recording. It looked like the perfect ending to a perfect evening. But Grace barely noticed. Her mind was on bus schedules, tomorrow's shift, and a field trip she still did not know how to afford. Life had a way of keeping dreams practical. Then something unexpected happened. One of the event coordinators hurried across the ballroom and stopped beside Ethan Walker. They exchanged a brief conversation. Ethan listened, nodded once, then stood. Several nearby guests immediately turned toward him. Cameras followed. The room seemed to sense movement before understanding its purpose. Ethan adjusted his jacket and stepped away from the VIP section. Not toward the stage. Not toward the donors. Not toward the reporters waiting for interviews. Instead, he began walking slowly across the ballroom. Through the crowd. Past investors. Past celebrities. Past everyone who expected his attention. His destination appeared to be somewhere near the back of the room. Claire watched him go. Then she looked toward Grace Bennett. For the first time all evening, she realized something remarkable was about to happen. The woman who had spent the entire night trying to disappear was about to become impossible to ignore. The first thing people noticed was not where Ethan Walker was going. It was where he was not going. He was not heading toward the reporters gathered near the stage. He was not approaching the donors who had spent the evening competing for his attention. He was not stopping to greet the celebrities clustered beneath the chandeliers. Instead, he continued walking steadily across the ballroom as conversations began to fade around him. One by one, heads turned. The movement spread through the room like ripples across still water. Guests followed his path with growing curiosity. Some smiled, assuming he was about to make an important announcement. Others lifted their phones. A few whispered among themselves. Ethan seemed unaware of any of it. His attention remained fixed on a single destination. Grace Bennett was stacking glassware near a service station when she sensed the change in atmosphere. The room sounded different. Quieter. She glanced up briefly and saw several guests looking in her direction. Confused, she turned to see what had captured their attention. Then her breath caught. Ethan Walker was walking straight toward her. Grace immediately looked behind herself. Surely he was heading somewhere else. Surely there was someone more important standing nearby. There always was. But when she turned back, he was only a few feet away. The billionaire stopped in front of her. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Grace suddenly became aware of every detail. The music, the lights, the dozens of eyes watching from every corner of the room. Her hands tightened around the tray she was carrying. Ethan offered a warm smile. Not the practice smile he used for cameras. Something quieter, more genuine. "Good evening," he said. Grace stared for half a second before finding her voice. "Good evening, sir." Around them, conversations disappeared entirely. Ethan glanced at the tray in her hands. "You have been working hard all night." Grace gave a nervous laugh. "That is usually how the job works." A few guests nearby smiled. Ethan did too. "I noticed." Grace did not know what to say. Nobody noticed. That was the entire point. She worked events like this every week. People remembered the wine, the flowers, the music. They rarely remembered the staff. Ethan studied her expression for a moment. Then he said something that caused several nearby guests to exchange surprised looks. "May I ask you a favor?" Grace blinked. "A favor?" "Yes. I'm not sure how I can help." Ethan glanced toward the dance floor where couples moved beneath the golden lights. The jazz band had shifted into a slower melody. Elegant. Timeless. The kind of song that seemed designed for memories. Then Ethan extended his hand. "Would you dance with me?" Silence crashed across the ballroom. Not awkward silence. Shocked silence. The kind that arrives when nobody knows what to say next. Grace froze. She honestly thought she had misheard him. "I am sorry." Ethan's smile widened slightly. "I asked if you would dance with me." The tray nearly slipped from her hands. Across the room, several guests openly stared. Cameras began turning. Even the musicians seemed to notice something unusual was happening. Grace shook her head instinctively. "No, I cannot." Ethan remained calm. "Why not?" She looked down at her uniform. Simple black attire. Comfortable shoes. Not a ballroom gown. Not someone worthy of a spotlight. "Because I work here. I know. People are watching. I know that too." Grace's heart pounded. She had spent the entire evening trying not to attract attention. Now she felt as though every eye in the building had found her at once. "Sir, I think there are many other people who would rather dance with you." Ethan followed her gaze across the ballroom. Wealthy guests. Influential guests. Beautiful guests. People accustomed to being chosen. Then he looked back at Grace. "Perhaps." His voice remained gentle. "But they are not the person I am asking." For a moment, neither of them moved. The music continued. Soft piano. Warm brass. The dance floor glowing beneath the chandeliers. Grace felt every insecurity she had spent years carrying suddenly rise to the surface. The bills. The long shifts. The exhaustion. The feeling of never quite belonging in places like this. Ethan seemed to sense all of it. His expression softened. "You have spent the entire night helping everyone else." He paused. "Please let someone see you for a moment." Grace looked at his outstretched hand, then at the hundreds of faces watching from around the room. Something inside her shifted. Not confidence. Not certainty. Something smaller. Courage. Just enough courage for one step. Slowly, she placed the tray on a nearby table. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached for his hand. The moment Grace Bennett placed her hand in Ethan Walker's, the ballroom seemed to exhale all at once. A soft murmur moved through the crowd. Guests exchanged confused glances. Cameras lifted higher. Some people smiled. Others simply stared. Nobody had expected this. Least of all Grace. Ethan gently guided her toward the dance floor. Every step felt unreal. The polished marble reflected the golden glow of the chandeliers overhead. Couples slowly drifted aside as they approached, creating space without being asked. Grace could hear her heartbeat louder than the music. "I should not be here," she whispered. Ethan glanced at her. "Why?" Grace almost laughed. "Because this is not my world." Ethan considered her answer as they reached the center of the floor. "You have spent the entire night making this evening better for everyone else." His voice remained calm. "I think that makes it your world too." The band continued playing. A slow melody filled the ballroom. Ethan carefully placed one hand near hers and maintained a respectful distance. Grace followed his lead awkwardly at first. It had been years since she had danced. Years since she had attended any event that did not involve work, school functions, or grocery shopping. Yet Ethan moved with surprising patience. There was no performance in his actions, no attempt to impress anyone, no desire to create a spectacle. If anything, he seemed to forget the audience entirely. Around them, the ballroom grew quieter. Conversations faded into the background. Even the photographers appeared reluctant to interrupt the moment. For the first time all evening, Grace felt seen. Not as a server, not as a single mother struggling to pay bills, not as someone people overlooked, simply as a person. The feeling was unfamiliar. "You look nervous," Ethan said gently. Grace smiled. "That is because several hundred people are watching." Ethan glanced around the room. "Then they should probably find something else to do." Grace laughed despite herself. A real laugh. One she had not expected. The sound surprised even her. Ethan smiled. "There it is." "What?" "The smile you keep trying to hide." Grace shook her head. "I am not hiding anything." Ethan raised an eyebrow. No. "Then why do you always leave before anyone can thank you?" Grace looked down briefly. The answer came easily because she had lived it for years. Because most people do not remember. Ethan did not respond immediately. The music carried them through another slow turn across the floor. Finally he spoke. "I remember." The words were simple, yet something about them landed deeply. Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. She quickly looked away. Across the ballroom, Claire Morrison watched from near the stage. She had seen Ethan negotiate billion-dollar deals. She had seen him address world leaders, investors, and journalists. Yet she could not remember the last time he looked this present, this human. Nearby guests seemed to sense it too. The room was no longer focused on status or wealth. Something else had taken center stage. Something quieter. Something real. Ethan looked at Grace again. "Can I ask you a question?" "I suppose that is fair." "What keeps you going?" Grace blinked. Of all the questions she expected, that was not one of them. She thought about the hospital bill folded in her purse, the double shifts, the early mornings, the endless calculations. Then she thought about a little girl asleep on a couch beneath a rainbow drawing. Her expression softened instantly. "My daughter." Ethan nodded as though he had expected the answer. "Lily." Grace looked surprised. "You know her name?" Ethan smiled slightly. "You said it earlier when you were reading a message." Grace shook her head. "I did not realize anyone heard. I hear more than people think." For a moment, they continued dancing in comfortable silence. Then Ethan's expression changed. Not sadness. Memory. The kind that arrives quietly and settles behind the eyes. "My mother worked 3 jobs when I was growing up," he said. Grace listened. She never complained. At least not where I could hear her. The music seemed softer now, more intimate. "Everything I have today exists because she refused to quit." Grace understood immediately. Not the wealth, not the fame, the sacrifice, the exhaustion hidden behind a smile, the determination children rarely notice until they become adults. Ethan looked toward the crowd briefly before returning his attention to her. "Tonight, I kept seeing reminders of her." Grace opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. Something in his voice told her there was more. Much more. And for the first time since stepping onto the dance floor, she realized this evening might not be about her at all. It might be about a story that had started long before either of them entered this ballroom. The music continued, but for Ethan Walker it seemed very far away now. He guided Grace through another slow turn beneath the chandeliers while memories he had spent years burying rose quietly to the surface. Around them, the ballroom remained captivated. Conversations had stopped. Even those who did not understand what was happening sensed that something important was unfolding. Grace noticed the change in Ethan's expression. It was the look of someone standing between the present and the past. "You said I reminded you of your mother," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "More than you know." He glanced toward the floor for a moment before continuing. "When I was 10 years old, my mother worked at a hotel outside Chicago. She cleaned rooms during the day and worked evening shifts in the banquet hall. Most guests never learned her name." Grace listened carefully. The story felt familiar in ways that made her chest tighten. "She came home exhausted every night," Ethan continued. "But somehow she always found enough energy to ask about my day. She always made me feel like I mattered." Grace smiled faintly. "That sounds like a good mother." Ethan's eyes softened. She was the best person I ever knew. For several seconds, neither spoke. The ballroom seemed to disappear around them. Then Ethan surprised her again. She passed away before she ever saw what happened to my career. Grace felt her heart sink. I am sorry. Ethan nodded gratefully. For years I thought success would make that easier. It did not. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Most powerful people spent their lives projecting certainty. Ethan sounded different. Human. Vulnerable. Real. Do you know what I remember most? He asked. Grace shook her head. Not the sacrifices. Not the long hours. I remember the little things. The way she helped people even when she had almost nothing herself. Ethan smiled sadly. Tonight I watched you do the same thing. Grace immediately looked away. I was only doing my job. No. Ethan's answer came gently but firmly. You were doing far more than that. Nearby, several guests were quietly wiping their eyes. Even Claire found herself unexpectedly emotional. The story had become larger than a dance. Larger than a gala. It was becoming a reminder of something many people had forgotten. Ethan slowly released one hand and gestured toward the room. Everyone here noticed the donations tonight. The auction. The headlines. But I noticed something else. Grace looked up at him. What? The way you treated people when you thought nobody was paying attention. The words landed with unexpected force. Grace felt tears gathering despite her efforts to stop them. Ethan continued. You helped employees, guests, maintenance workers, anyone who needed kindness. He smiled. My mother was exactly the same. The song was nearing its end now. The final notes floated through the ballroom like a gentle farewell. Ethan looked toward the stage and then back at Grace. A decision seemed to settle inside him. Slowly, he turned to face the crowd. Hundreds of eyes focused on him immediately. The room became silent. Completely silent. Ethan took a microphone from a nearby stand. No speech had been planned. No announcement appeared on the schedule. Yet everyone instinctively knew they were about to witness something memorable. Ethan looked at Grace first. Then he looked at the audience. Tonight, he said, his voice carrying through the ballroom, I met someone who reminded me what this foundation was supposed to stand for. The crowd listened without moving. Ethan continued. We spend a lot of time celebrating success. But success means very little if we stop seeing the people who make our world better every day. Grace stood frozen beside him. Her hands trembled slightly. Ethan smiled toward her. This woman spent the entire evening helping others without asking for recognition. She represents something we should honor more often. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Not obligated applause. Genuine applause. People rose from their chairs. One table after another stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, nearly the entire ballroom was on its feet. Grace covered her mouth as tears finally escaped. For years, she had worked in rooms like this without being noticed. Tonight, an entire ballroom was standing because someone had finally chosen to see her. The applause seemed endless. It rolled across the ballroom like a wave, rising from every corner of the room until even the people standing near the exits were clapping. Grace Bennett stood motionless beneath the chandeliers, overwhelmed by a feeling she could barely describe. It was not pride. It was not victory. It was something much simpler and far more powerful. For the first time in years, she did not feel invisible. Ethan Walker waited for the applause to settle before speaking again. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. There is one more thing I would like to do tonight. The room immediately grew quiet. Guests returned to their seats, eager to hear what came next. Ethan looked toward Grace. Earlier this evening, I learned that Grace is raising a remarkable young daughter named Lily. Grace's eyes widened slightly. She had not expected him to mention her. Ethan smiled. Children learn from what they see. And if Lily grows up to be anything like her mother, then the future is in very good hands. A warm ripple of applause spread through the room once more. Grace lowered her eyes, fighting back tears. Then Ethan turned toward the audience. Beginning tonight, the Walker Foundation will establish a new scholarship program dedicated to hardworking single parents who are building better lives for their children. The ballroom erupted again. Several guests immediately stood. Others nodded in approval. Ethan continued. And the first scholarship will carry the name of a woman who reminded us all why kindness matters. He looked directly at Grace. The Grace Bennett Family Opportunity Scholarship. For a moment, Grace thought she had misunderstood. The room around her blurred. The lights, the music, the applause all seemed distant. Ethan stepped closer and lowered his voice, so only she could hear. "This is not charity." Grace looked at him. "What is it?" Ethan smiled. "Recognition." Those single words broke through every wall she had built around herself. Years of exhaustion. Years of sacrifice. Years of quietly carrying burdens nobody else could see. She covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness. Tears of relief. The kind that arrive when someone finally acknowledges a struggle you thought you had to carry alone. Nearly an hour later, the gala slowly began to end. Guests gathered their coats. Conversations filled the ballroom once again. Photographers packed their equipment. Staff members began clearing tables. The magic of the evening was fading into memory. Grace returned to the service area to collect her belongings. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then she noticed an envelope resting on top of her locker. Her name was written across the front. Inside was a handwritten note. "Grace, thank you for reminding an entire room what real strength looks like. Tell Lily congratulations on her spelling test." Ethan. Grace stared at the note and laughed softly through fresh tears. Somehow he had remembered. Of course he had. Outside, the city lights stretched across the skyline like scattered stars. Grace stepped onto the sidewalk and pulled out her phone. It was nearly midnight. She called home immediately. Mrs. Dalton answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" Grace smiled. "Everything is wonderful." A few moments later, a sleepy voice appeared on the line. "Mom." Grace closed her eyes. "Hi, sweetheart. Did you have a good night?" Grace looked back through the ballroom windows one final time. She thought about the dance, the applause, the kindness she never expected. Most of all, she thought about how one ordinary evening had changed because someone chose to see what everyone else had overlooked. "Yes," she whispered. "I really did." Lily yawned. "I told you we got this." Grace laughed through her tears. "You sure did." As she walked toward home beneath the glow of the city lights, she carried no trophy, no grand prize, no miracle fortune. What she carried was something far more valuable. The certainty that dignity does not come from wealth, status, or power. It comes from the way we treat people when nobody is watching. And sometimes, the person standing quietly in the background is the one who teaches the entire room what truly matters.